Welcome to Module 3. In this section of the course, we will dive deeper into property analysis and selection. It is said that investors make their money when they buy, not when they sell. Of course, most people think it's when you sell, but really the money is made when you buy. This is because buying the right property in the right market or the right city is far more reliable as a method of generating superior returns than buying property and trying to figure out the ideal time to sell. I've just never seen anybody who can truly time a market with any degree of accuracy. Now, admittedly, I've gotten lucky many times, okay? And I'd rather be lucky than good any day of the week, but unfortunately, luck is not a reliable strategy. So we want to learn how to buy successfully. Okay, so let's dive in. What are we going to learn? We're going to talk about the 4 key areas of property acquisition. Number 1, evaluation. Number 2, pro forma projections and how to read and analyze that property performance. It's so important. Number 3, area evaluation. You know, what's the neighborhood like? What's the city like? What's the community like? Number 4, leverage and financing. So if you're ready, let's dive in and let's check it out. Hey, amazing students, welcome back. This is your instructor, Jason, and we are moving along in this course and moving quickly. So glad you got through a lot of the math and the evaluation stuff in the last module. And now we're going to get into property evaluation. How do we find that gem? How do we find that diamond in the rough? How do we find a good property? How do we evaluate a good property? Well, we went over a lot of the math already in the last module. So now we're going to look at some of the other characteristics. We're going to learn how to evaluate a property that you find and you know, decide whether or not it's a good deal. We're going to learn how to compare the property with other properties in the area and learn how to compare the property with properties in other areas. As you know, I am a nationwide investor. And when people talk about the real estate market, you know, you hear them on the news and they say, well, the real estate market in the United States is doing this or that, or the housing market is doing this or that. I don't know what they're talking about. I don't know if they're talking about Los Angeles or Dallas or Chicago or Memphis or Atlanta or Miami or Boston or New York or Seattle. You know, there are really about 400 unique housing markets or real estate markets in a country as large and diverse as the United States. And no matter where you are in the world taking this course, that is probably true in your country because real estate is a very localized business. There's an old saying in real estate that all real estate is local. So for example, if you're in Germany, you know, the market in Munich is different than the market in Stuttgart. All real estate is local. So it doesn't matter where you are in the world. That is definitely true. So let's jump in and talk about this. So what about income production? You know, we need to measure the rent to value ratio by showing the property's ability to generate income. The schools, you know, what are we going to look for in terms of schools? What are we going to look for in terms of the LTI? Remember my little trademark LTI, or land to improvement ratio. You know, what is the comparison of the building, the improvement sitting on the land versus the land value? That tells you a lot about your risk. What is the crime like in the area? You know, are we looking for a low crime area that will generally be more attractive to tenants? But, you know, it's not always, you know, some of these rules are not always true. There's always an exception. You know, when we're learning languages, especially a language like English, you know, there's the rules And then there are a bunch of exceptions to the rule just to make things more complicated and keep us on our toes. So we'll kind of examine some of these things. So let's talk about comparing the property to other deals in the area. Well, we want to chart out where the property value lands in terms of the comparable listings and sales in the area. So the position versus the area price average. What I like to do when I look at a market and when I look at a property in that market is I take just very simplistically, and doing this in my head, I take the median price in a given area, and I always want to be a little bit below the median price. I don't want to be in the really slummy properties, because those properties, they look much better on paper than they are in real life. We've definitely learned that lesson over the years, but we don't want to be too expensive, because those properties don't have good land to improvement ratios, and they certainly don't have good rent to value ratios. So the properties priced low in an area tend to be pulled by other properties in the area. So when you are buying the worst house in the best neighborhood, the general concept, although there are exceptions to this one too, but the general concept is that the other prices in that neighborhood will tend to have a pulling effect on the value of your property and pull it up fairly easily. But if you buy the most expensive property in that neighborhood, your value will generally be pulled down by the median or average price areas in that neighborhood, okay? What about schools? What about crime? So good quality schools and low crime, they definitely impact value, and those things are definitely more desirable. So what about when we compare a property to properties in other areas? So we want to look at a market area in terms of its differentiation. What are its points of differentiation? Well, some areas tend to have higher land value and lower rent to value ratios, okay? These are the areas we tend to not like as much, okay? Because they just don't make sense. You can't make the income work, and they become more speculative. When we look at something that I call the Hartman Risk Evaluator, something that I've taught to thousands of people over the years, this is something that really can help keep you safe in terms of that land to improvement ratio. The higher land value markets, they tend to be, like we talked about at the very beginning of the course, the cyclical markets, whereas the lower land value markets tend to be the more linear markets. And the hybrid markets are the areas in between the two. And I, as you know by now, I like the lower land value markets that are more stable and more linear in nature. But some people, they like the roller coaster, they like gambling, they like taking big chances, and that's why they call themselves investors when I really call them speculators, and they're into those high land value markets. Well, what about tax considerations? Property taxes really can be a big deal. They can vary dramatically as you look around the U.S. and as you look around the world. This is one thing I also want to share with you. Some of the sort of old school investors, they love the idea of having free and clear properties. And you probably have sensed by now that I don't like having free and clear properties. I have a few sayings about that. I talk a lot about inflation-induced debt destruction and how the best insurance you can have on a property, oddly, is a high loan balance. I know that's totally counterintuitive. But if a disaster happens and you have an insurance claim on your property, your lender, in essence, becomes your partner in protecting the collateral sometimes. And this is why I don't like paying off my properties. Whenever possible, I like to have loans on my properties because the debt is good debt. It's investment grade debt, and it's debt that I as the investor, or you as the investor, are outsourcing to somebody else. somebody called a tenant. They pay our debts for us. Now, otherwise, I don't like debt, but in that case, I do. So property taxes, like debt, they represent a perpetual lien on your property. So your property, as long as you're in a jurisdiction, which almost every jurisdiction on earth, not all of them, there are a few exceptions, but not many, almost every jurisdiction around the globe has property taxes. And those property taxes represent a perpetual lien on your property. So you never really own a property free and clear. Don't be fooled that it's just about the mortgage. It's also about the property taxes and other areas that have homeowners associations. That represents another type of lien on your property. So free and clear property is largely a myth, okay? So areas with higher property taxes, well, they tend to have higher rents, but some of these more expensive areas, in this situation, it represents a pass-through to the tenant, where the tenant is really, in essence, paying the property taxes. You're really outsourcing it to them. But some of these areas with really high prices and high taxes at the same time, they don't have good rent-to-value ratios. So you've got to keep both of these things in mind when you're looking at investments. Taxes push people out of the buyer pool and into the renter pool. So that may be good, because it pushes up your rents and creates more demand for rental housing. So tax considerations, a valid concern. What do you take away from this conversation? Well, different market areas have varying characteristics that influence the relative price and rental ratios, or RV ratios, for those properties. There's another consideration that I want to just have you keep in mind. And that is the concept of landlord friendliness. When my company helps people invest around the country, we look for jurisdictions generally, and we make some exceptions to this at times, because we do business in Illinois and the Chicagoland area, which tends to not be so landlord friendly, but it has some other good characteristics that make us interested in that area. But we look for markets that are friendly to our cause as landlords. For example, there are two famous cities in California, the state I've lived in most of my life and live in now, in La Jolla, California. But there are two sort of famous or infamous areas in California that are known to be especially landlord unfriendly. The whole state of California is not very landlord friendly. It's very tenant friendly, not landlord friendly. But two specific areas in California that they sort of jokingly call the People's Republic of San Francisco and the People's Republic of Santa Monica, okay, these two coastal cities, they tend to be very landlord unfriendly. So these are markets that we would not like as investors. We want areas that are friendly to our cause, so that if we get a bad tenant, and occasionally you do, and we have to kick them out and we have to evict that tenant because they're not paying or they're not taking care of the property, then we want to be able to do that swiftly. And in places that tend to be more right-wing, whether they be Texas or Tennessee or Arkansas or many of the other areas, Georgia to a slightly lesser degree, these areas are more landlord friendly. So that's just another consideration I want you to keep in mind. So let's take a look at a demonstration here and see if we can find the gem, okay? And your action item, okay? This one you're going to do on your own. All you got to do is go to good old Zillow, Trulia, or any other site that will provide this insight, okay? And all you've got to do is capture some images of the information you gather for 5 target properties. And, this is on a screenshot, and just append it with a provided document and explain what insights you gained from the information you found. When you looked at some of the things we talked about in this lesson, when you looked at the property taxes, when you considered just generally the landlord friendliness or unfriendliness, when you consider the rental values, these things are not they're not mathematical equations like we were doing in the last module. These are, they're more anecdotal. So these are things that, are narrative in nature and definitely tend to carry some opinion with them. So just check that out and surf around and look for some of this stuff and just upload a screenshot of the images and your thoughts about them, and you'll earn your badge. And I will look forward to seeing you on the next lesson.